Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Doug Dahman. I'm the educational coordinator at the Civil War Museum and the Kenosha Public Museum here in Kenosha, Wisconsin. We thank you for joining us for our July edition of the Second Friday Lecture. With us today is Dr. Christian Keller, and Dr. Keller is going to talk to us about German-American soldiers in the Civil War, a military and social overview. I want to say thank you to start, of course, to our title sponsor to the Second Friday Lecture Program, which is the Civil War Roundtable and Iron Brigade Association of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And just another note that, as you know, those of you who have been tuning into these via our Facebook page or the YouTube channel, we've been doing these virtually since last April. Thankfully, next month, August of 2021, we're going to be able to have an in-person crowd at the museum. And so we will begin featuring our Second Friday lectures again for an in-person crowd. But the plan is to also record them and post them to our YouTube channel. So stay tuned for further details about that. But Reverend Robert Miller of Chicago will be talking to us about the Notre Dame chaplains in August of next month. So we look forward to having people back in the facility for that. But we are so glad to have Dr. Christian Keller join us today from Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Dr. Keller, thank you so much for agreeing to do this and then linking up with us via the Zoom profile here. For those of you out there, Dr. Christian Keller has been professor of history in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where he teaches courses for senior leaders on the theory of war and strategy, national security policy and strategy, and the American Civil War. In 2017, he was named the General Dwight D. Eisenhower Chair of National Security, and in 2019 became the director of the Military History Program. Previously, he served as professor of military history for 5.5 years at the Army Command and General Staff College in Fort Belvoir in Virginia, and has also taught at numerous civilian institutions, including Shippensburg University, Gettysburg College, Dickinson College, and Washington and Lee University. Dr. Keller earned his PhD from Penn State in 2001. He was a Fulbright professor in Germany, and along with many scholarly articles focusing on strategic, operational, and ethnic topics in the Civil War, he's author of Chancellorsville and the Germans, Nativism, Ethnicity, and Civil War Memory, co-author of Damn Dutch, Pennsylvania Germans at Gettysburg, co-author of Pennsylvania, A Military History, and author of the nationally acclaimed The Great Partnership, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and the Fate of the Confederacy, which won the 2020 Douglas Southall Freeman Award and was a finalist for the 2019 Gilder Lehrman Military History Prize. A native of Carlisle, Dr. Keller lives with his wife Kelly in an antebellum house that witnessed the Confederate occupation of Carlisle Barracks in June of 1863. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Christian Keller.
Thank you, Doug. I appreciate that very nice introduction, and I appreciate the invitation to be able to come here and speak for your group, and particularly now that there is an exhibition on immigrant soldiers in your museum, replete with relics and letters that represent local soldiers of German and other ethnicities who marched away to fight for the Union. So today, folks, what I'll be talking about is primarily the role of German-American soldiers in the Civil War and what they did in it, and how their ethnicity and their ethnic beliefs influenced some of their actions. But I'll also be referring to the Irish and to the Scandinavian troops here and there, and of course, all in reference to the greater Anglo-American core population, which represented the majority of the United States northern population in 1860. So without further ado, I'm just going to jump right on into my slideshow here and move us forward. One thing that we need to remember when we think about the immigrant soldiers in the Union armies, indeed in the Confederate armies as well, though they were a very small minority in the rebel ranks, is that there was a great wave of immigration that came into the United States in the antebellum period. And this slide represents the very last stages of that, even during the war itself, a wartime print. And you can see there the signs are both in English and in German to try to recruit these people as soon as they came off the boat, quite literally. That was not a cliche. That actually did occur in New York Harbor and in other great entrepôts of the northern port cities. And it's important for us to understand that this wave of immigration that came in the antebellum period strongly created an ethnic minority population, particularly in the North, that had voting and demographic power. And by way of background, it's important for us to understand that as early as the 1848 election, you start to see German and Irish voting power in particularly the northern states having an effect on the result of local, state, and even some national elections. And by the time you get to Lincoln's election in 1860, it's actually quite significant. And the German and the Irish vote together comprised a very serious percentage of the voting bloc in the northern states. This did not sit very well with some of the Anglo-American population in the North, a good percentage of which was concerned about this new immigration, as they called it. And though they themselves were immigrants and descendants of immigrants, because the Native Americans were the original Americans, the Anglo-Americans felt some concern about the Irish and the Germans coming in and usurping their power and starting to change the culture of the northern states. So they were very worried about the drinking issue. Temperance was a very strong movement in the northern states at this time. They were worried as well about the advent of too much Catholicism, or popery as it was called. And then lastly, they didn't like the different languages that these people spoke. For the Germans, it was quite evident. They spoke a very foreign tongue. And for the Irish, many of them also spoke Gaelic along with English. And when that was heard, that didn't make people very happy, of Anglo-American descent at least. So we see a movement arise politically in response to these great waves of antebellum immigration that persists into the war years. A nativistic movement that was personified by an American party called the American Party, or colloquially called the Know Nothings, that was bent on making political war on the immigrant. And for a while, they actually gained a great deal of power in the lower north, the Midwest and Pennsylvania, even some of the border slave states. They did very well, but they could not handle the issue of slavery, and so they fell apart and were replaced in many ways by the Republicans. This matters for our story today because this anti-immigrant bias, prejudice, if you will persist in the Republican Party, which absorbs the know-nothings. And that matters when it comes to how the German-American soldiers feel that they are being treated during the war, and how their relatives and loved ones at home feel that they're being treated by the majoritarian party in the North. It's important to note that most of the antebellum immigration traditionally adhered to the Democratic Party in the years before the Civil War, because the Democrats were more welcoming to immigrant voters, and they frankly embraced them because they wanted to swell their ranks and their voting power, particularly in the cities where many of the immigrants initially would reside. The Republicans courted away a good percentage of the Germans in the 1860 election. Very slight majority of the German Americans in the North are going to vote for Abraham Lincoln in 1860. That trend will be reversed in the 64 election, which I will explain more about later. And there are reasons why that have to do with this resurgence of nativism, which is going to come back in the war, and it has to do with wartime events. This is a late antebellum view of one of the great cities of the northern states in 1857. Philadelphia, very large city of the day, very packed with immigrants, Irish and Germans. And it's important for us to understand that all of the great northern cities, regardless of where they were, in Pennsylvania or in New York or in Illinois or in Wisconsin, they all had large German ethnic areas, wards of the city that were entirely German. And most of that is gone today in the early 21st century. You only see vestiges of it in some of the Midwestern cities like Milwaukee. But in the late antebellum time, you could walk through entire sections of the city and not hear English spoken. This was something too that worried the Anglo-Americans because they thought they were losing control of their own neighborhoods. There was a substance of truth in the sense that high percentages of cities like Milwaukee, like Chicago, like Buffalo, New York, like St. Louis, Missouri, were very heavily populated with German Americans who spoke a foreign tongue. And that could be intimidating to native English speakers. And that did fuel the ranks of the know-nothings and their political movement, unfortunately. Another point to think about when you look at this image is to realize that the majority of the immigration out of Germany will stop in these large cities, sometimes for a generation, and then accumulating enough money after a period of time, they would move out of the cities and into smaller towns further west. The idea was to go get cheaper land out in the Midwestern states, which was offered at the time. And hence you see a large immigration going into Wisconsin, going into Michigan, Illinois, and other states in the Midwest at the end of the 1840s and into the 1850s, enhancing the immigrant population in those states. But there were still very large concentrations of German immigrants in these large cities. And that's important for us to consider because it's out of the large cities, not the smaller towns in the rural areas, that the ethnic regiments will emanate. And these regiments really captured the imagination of German America, and indeed of all of the North's population, because they were fairly unique, almost like an allied or a quasi-mercenary force within the Union armies themselves. But I would like to just add that not all of the Germans are going to join these ethnic regiments. More on that to come. And here is a recruiting poster from early in the war of what was the 40th Pennsylvania, later the 75th Pennsylvania. It recruited entirely out of Philadelphia, very German-speaking regiment. You can see that the poster is entirely in German. This would have been duplicated in all the major cities of the North throughout the war, and particularly in 1861 and 1862. But it's important to realize that really only about 25% of the German soldiers, the German-born soldiers and the ethnically German soldiers of the Union served in these ethnic regiments. The majority of them would serve in local, as I call them, American regiments that marched out of their home areas, particularly in the Midwestern counties and farming districts. And so when we think about the experience of German American soldiers in the American Civil War, we need to realize at the beginning that not all of these soldiers are serving in these strongly ethnic regiments that march out of the urban areas. Some are serving in rural-based and rural-raised regiments, and the command language is English, and these immigrants have to begin to understand English. In many cases, for the first time, in a real daily way. They would often cluster in little immigrant communities out in the backcountry, and they would cluster in ethnic companies within the Anglo-American regiments, which they would serve in. But these Germans had a bit more of an Americanization experience as the war proceeded, because they were mixed in with their non-German neighbors, who, by the way, were not just, of course, Anglo-Americans, but also Irish and Scandinavian and every other ethnicity under the sun as well. Whereas their brothers who served in the German regiments that came out of the cities, they are almost exclusively all German, at least for the first half of the war, before they became diluted. They had a different experience. and they were brigaded together. These strongly German regiments brigaded together, ultimately comprising an almost entirely German-speaking division in the Eastern theater of operations. This did not reoccur in the Western theater, where the German regiments were scattered about and not concentrated, but in the East, and ultimately in the great Union Army of the Potomac, there would be a very strong concentration of the German-speaking soldiery, particularly those that hailed from the Eastern cities and that served in the all-ethnic German regiments that came out of those cities. That means things for the experiences of a lot of the German-American soldiers in the American Civil War, because the spotlight was on these regiments, like the 75th Pennsylvania, that would later serve in what became known as the 11th Corps. What they did was viewed as representational of all German soldiers in all of the theaters of the war, and representational of the efforts of all German Americans for the Union war effort. So this concentration of German soldiery made a difference, even though it was exclusively in the Eastern theater. And the Western German language newspapers and Anglo-American newspapers followed the exploits of this concentration of German regiments, which I'll explain more about here. So the first commander of what became known as the German division was Brigadier General Ludwig Blenker. He and many of his officers, and indeed many of the officers of the ethnically German regiments, were old 48ers, meaning they were survivors of the failed German Revolution of 1848, and they fled Germany, the German states, when those revolutions were put down at the point of Prussian bayonets, and others, Austrian bayonets as well. And they came first to England and other countries, and then ultimately to the United States. And they were the natural leaders of the German-American population in the late antebellum period, and then later the German regiments themselves. Some of them had good military experience, like Franz Sigel. Some of them did not, like Karl Schurz. Blenker had some experience. And a lot of them had strong political connections to the nascent Republican Party, or were so powerful in their local areas that they were able to get political appointments. That brought them up pretty high in the national spotlight. The German division mattered, folks, because it was an entire division of German-speaking troops early in the war. And very quickly, it brought national attention to itself, by no fault of its own, I would add, because of what happened in the Shenandoah Valley Campaign of 1862. Now, meanwhile, out in the Western theater, the German regiments that were raised primarily in Wisconsin and Michigan and Illinois and Missouri, they're fighting their own series of battles, but they're not concentrated, as I said, whereas most of the Germans from the eastern cities like Philadelphia and New York are put together in this German division. And they are sent on a very arduous trek across 3 Virginia mountain ranges to go after Stonewall Jackson and bag him, as Abraham Lincoln requested in the spring of 1862. Unfortunately, they failed. And in the process of trying to bag Jackson, they gave themselves a black mark in the mind's eye of the people of the North. And this Confederate propaganda cartoon, ironically drawn by a fellow named Folk, who was a Confederate German American who created cartoons for the Confederate press. This represents the plundering, so-called, of the Blenkerites in the Shenandoah Valley during this time. And this was significant because it was a significant amount of bad press that then accumulated onto the shoulders of the German-American soldiers in this German division. And the Northern English-speaking public never forgot it. This is in the period of the war before war on civilians was acceptable. Why did the Germans plunder? Did they plunder in the Shenandoah Valley? Well, in fact, they did. And the reason was because they were very poorly supplied by the Federal War Department. For example, they were given 3 ambulances for an entire division of troops. And this is an early war division, not a later war, so it's a very large number of men. They almost starved trying to go after Stonewall Jackson because their sutlers and supply wagons officially sent by the War Department never caught up with them. So they ended up foraging. Again, in a period of the war when this was considered poor form. And the Confederate propagandists had a field day. So did the more nativist-leaning Anglo-American newspapers of the North, who portrayed these Germans as rather barbaric mercenary types who needed to be watched carefully, or else they were going to do this kind of thing and give a bad mark to the overall glorious cause of reunion. And this was something that the good patriotic American citizens in the North, quote unquote, did not want to see. Keep in mind this early bad reputation that the German division will accrue as we continue forward. So after the plundering in the valley, this German division was moved further east into Virginia, and it took part in the Great Second Manassas Campaign in 1862 in the late summer. It was not very well commanded there, I have to say, and in the interests of brevity, I'll say that the troops fought well, but their commanders did not as well as they could have. And Second Manassas, moreover, was another Federal defeat, not unlike the skirmishes and battles that the German division had against Jackson in the Valley, on top of the plundering. So there's now also, on top of this reputation of plundering and being bad soldiers, the German soldiers are being portrayed as less than stellar as fighters in the Northern press. And again, there is a predisposition to view the German immigrants that dates back to the antebellum period, as I mentioned earlier, to see them as second-class citizens who need to be watched because they're bringing a foreign element into American society. Pay no attention to the fact they're serving their country gallantly, and in many cases without enough supply. They are not worthy, so to speak, of the support of the greater Northern population. This was kind of an idea that was circulating in many of the leading Union newspapers as 1862 turns into 1863. Early in 1863, the old German division is absorbed into what we call the 11th Corps of the Union Army of the Potomac. And most of the viewers are familiar with the fact that the Union and Confederate armies are composed of corps, which are then composed of divisions and then composed of brigades. Well, the 11th Corps, by the time of early spring 1863, having absorbed Blenker's German division, Blenker now dismissed from service for mistakes that he made, it is about 60% German speaking. And it's important for us to note at this point that the German-born soldiery in the Union Army's total in both the Eastern and Western theaters represented as much as 20% of all of the Union soldiers under arms. Early chroniclers gave that percentage at about 9.5% to 10%, as high as 12%. But if you count the sons of the original German immigrants who also would have spoken German and had ethnic German folkways, then you're looking at a much higher percentage. And my earlier research went into this in some depth, and I discussed this in my book, Chancellorsville and the Germans, as well. The 11th Corps was viewed when attached to the Army of the Potomac as a stepson. It was seen in many ways as a remnant of the earlier war that was unwanted, that had a reputation for bad behavior and failure. And the Anglo-American soldiers in the rest of the Army of the Potomac looked at the 11th Corps askance and thought that, well, these guys need to be carefully watched. And again, this idea of nativism is rampant in the Anglo-American ranks in the bulk of the Army of the Potomac because it had been rampant in American society in general before the war. So the stage is set for a problem when, on the late afternoon of the 2nd of May, 1863, Stonewall Jackson is going to unleash his 20,000 odd Confederate troops into the flank of the 11th Corps, which occupied the extreme right of the Union line at Chancellorsville, south of the Rappahannock River. It was hanging in the air, as Jeb Stuart reported to Lee and to Jackson at their last meeting earlier on the evening of the 1st, and it was ripe for the plucking. Why was it hanging in the air? Well, there are all kinds of reasons for this, and again, I go into great detail in the book about this, but it's important for us to know that General Howard, Oliver Otis Howard, who was a non-German, a West Point trained teetotaling New Englander, in fact, had replaced the darling of German America, Franz Sigel, as commander of the 11th Corps just a couple months before. He was not very well liked by the German soldiery. Howard probably did not heed orders from General Joseph Hooker, commander of the Union Army at the time, to secure his flank. Hooker thought that Jackson's great flank march, illustrated there on the map, might be actually a flanking movement. Hooker wanted to believe, as did Daniel Sickles, who reported a lot on Confederate movements that day, that the Confederates were retreating to the south. It was what they wanted to believe. They had some confirmation bias going on. But Hooker did send 2 orders to Howard to take care to your right and, quote, prepare for any contingency. And there is strong evidence that Howard pocketed the order. And in any event, all he did was reposition 2 regiments only and 2 cannon to face to the west. He didn't think anything could come out of the vast wilderness and attack him. And unfortunately, Sickles and Hooker did not help Howard very much, because they took the reserve brigade of the 11th Corps under Billy Barlow, and along with Sickles' entire corps, went on a wild goose chase down there to Catherine Furnace, which is also illustrated on the map. That left a mile-wide gap between the 11th Corps and the rest of the Union Army, centered around the Chancellorsville location. This was something that Confederates could not have perceived ahead of time, but it made their job easier. And so when Jackson unleashes his Confederates, the 11th Corps is isolated. It is not prepared for an attack from the west. Carl Schurz, whom I mentioned earlier, one of the great 48er leaders who had come to the United States, who had risen to division command in the 11th Corps, foresaw that the attack was going to happen, along with many other lower level leaders in the 11th Corps of German descent. And they asked Howard, can we reposition? Our scouts are telling us that the enemy is going to hit us from the right. And Howard refused. Then they went to Hooker, and they never even got a chance to talk to General Hooker, the Army commander, because his aides turned them away as, quote, excitable Dutchmen. The word Dutchman in the 1860s and earlier was an Anglo-American euphemism that represented anybody that spoke a foreign language without an Irish accent or without a French accent. It was a catch-all phrase, generally representational of how Anglo-Americans thought of Germans. It's a bastardization of the German word for German, which is Deutsch. So today you hear people talk about their Dutch ancestry. Well, they're probably not referring to people from Holland. This goes back a long way in American culture and society. And at the time of the Civil War, the Germans were just allegorically referred to as Dutchmen. Unfortunately for the 11th Corps, this attack that hit them on the flank was overwhelming, and they are going to engage in a series of defensive lines, but it won't be enough. There's a picture of Oliver Otis Howard in 1863, not liked by his German soldiery, as I indicated. He personally held little bias against them, so he had that going for him. But he probably did not do what he was supposed to at Chancellorsville, and thus set his corps up for a fall. And by the way, he's going to get away almost completely squeaky clean at the end of this campaign, in which his soldiers will receive the brunt of the blame. And this is an artist's rendering of Jackson's attack on the 11th Corps. And you can see there a Union soldier with the half moon symbol on his hat being driven forward. He's been captured. And indeed, a percentage of the 11th Corps was captured on the 2nd of May in the evening before the Confederate attack sputtered out. A lot of the soldiers stood and fought, though, and this was captured in the German language press and not in the Anglo-American press. And I'm going to read you some excerpts from both presses here shortly to give you an idea of how the action on the night of the 2nd was portrayed and why it matters to us. So the attack was very powerful, and a percentage of the 11th Corps was forced to run. This is a sketch that came out of the post-war famous Battles and Leaders series. This was the popular conception of the 11th Corps' performance on the night of the 2nd. It is an overgeneralization, as I indicate in my earlier work. The Germans did stand and fight as best they could considering the circumstances, and that's not an exculpation, because some of them did run. But many of them didn't, and they held up Jackson's attack several critical hours, which probably prevented him, as I write in my Great Partnership book that came out in 2019 that Doug mentioned, that probably prevented Jackson from doing what he really wanted to do that night, which was cut the entire Union Army off from its retreat routes back across the Rappahannock. That could have been a war-winning move. And the 11th Corps' defensive stands may have very well prevented that. I'm not going to go so far as to say it did, but it definitely helped stall Jackson's attack. The advent of nightfall certainly also helped. One of the defensive stands of the 11th Corps, and particularly the German regiments in it, was at this place called the Bushback Line, very close to what was then called Dowdall's Tavern. That was Howard's headquarters. You can see that right there in the middle. This is a sketch that was in the Library of Congress. And this stand, though it only held Jackson up about 20 to 25 minutes, was one of several that the 11th Corps made, generally in parts, not as an entire corps, as they retreated eastward with Jackson's hordes on their tails. And again, it's important because the German soldiers believed, who participated in these various stands, that they had fought as well as they could considering the circumstances. They knew that night was falling. They knew they were buying time for the rest of the Union Army to recover from this blow. And they knew the sacrifice of their comrades who were falling right and left around them. And this is not what is going to get portrayed in the Anglo-American press. The German language press, is represented by this newspaper here, is going to have a very different story. And this is where the story of the German soldiers in the Civil War gets extremely interesting, because Chancellorsville, as interpreted in the presses, particularly the Anglo-American and the German presses, is going to become a watershed moment for the German immigration in the northern states. And this idea of nativism that was prevalent before the war is going to come surging back, because a scapegoat had to be found for this latest of Union defeats in the East. Pay no attention to the Union victories in the West. The Germans have failed in the East. A scapegoat must be found. Hooker got some of the blame in the Anglo-American press, yes, for failing once again after many other generals before him in charge of the Army of the Potomac. But it was all too easy for the already nativistically inclined northern newspaper editors, particularly those in charge of Republican papers, to jump on the old canard that it was the Germans' fault. They're the reason that Chancellorsville turned into a failure. Again, pay no attention to the poor deployment of the Corps, to the fact that Howard didn't position it well, that none of that came out, at least not initially. And I write in the book that this really, really pained the German language editors who brought this out because they were getting letters home from the German soldiers themselves. What were some of these comments that were being made? Well, there are two ways to look at this from the Anglo-American perspective to start with. There were quite a few negative comments from these English-speaking soldiers in the Army of the Potomac, particularly those that did not serve in the 11th Corps and that weren't anywhere close to the 11th Corps on May 2nd, 1863. Colonel Robert McAllister of the 11th New Jersey told his wife, quote, that the Germans were, quote, panic-stricken and perfectly worthless, but our brave boys heeded them not and treated them with perfect contempt. Private Smith of the 76th New York said that the Germans, quote, broke and ran in the most cowardly manner, pushing aside the brave regiments in cowardly ways. And a soldier in the 4th Ohio wrote to his son, quote, every Dutchman was making for the river trying to save his own cowardly body. Later on, French-American Colonel Régis de Trobriand probably summed up the general mood in the rest of the Union Army of the Potomac about the Germans when he said, quote, the 11th Corps was the object of a general hue and cry, nobody stopping to ask if there were not some extenuating circumstances. This was a comment after the extenuating circumstances were brought out. But at the time in 1863, they were not. And further, it was not just letters home from the German soldiers to the Anglo-American press and to their loved ones that made things difficult for the Germans in the 11th Corps and for their loved ones at home. It was also reported in the major Union newspapers immediately. On May 5th, the New York Times was among the most vociferous in slandering the German soldiery of the 11th Corps, stating, quote, but to the disgrace of the 11th Corps, be it said that the division of General Schurz, which was the first assailed, almost instantly gave way. Threats, entreaties, and orders of commanders were of no avail. Thousands of these cowards threw down their guns and soon streamed down the road towards headquarters. General Howard, with all his daring and resolution and vigor, could not stem the tide of the retreating and cowardly poltroons. Notice the trend here. Calling the Germans cowards. Well, that was a big deal then as today. Any soldier under arms, particularly one who has fought hard and has seen his comrades die around him, who is called a coward, doesn't take it well. And the Germans are already sensitive to barbs of nativism from the antebellum period and blaming them of plundering in the Shenandoah Valley and poor performance before Chancellorsville. They are not going to take these reports well. And what really happened was that the New York Times and the New York Herald report, New York Herald wasn't much better, saying, quote, the disastrous and disgraceful giving way of General Schurz's division or General Howard's Corps completely changed the fortunes of the day. The men, I am told, fled like so many sheep before a pack of wolves, and the enemy rushed up, taking possession of the abandoned line. The reports in the Times and the Herald were reprinted all throughout the other major northern newspapers. And variations of these themes continued for weeks. So this didn't just happen for a day or two, it went on for weeks. This calumny, this bias, this prejudicial reporting, which was inaccurate. It didn't mention anything about the defensive stands taken by the 11th Corps until it was too late, until several weeks after the damage had been done. And the Germans of the North, both in and out of the army, looked at these newspapers, and they came to their commanders like Karl Schurz and Alexander Schimmelpfennig and asked, what can we do about this? And their commanders admitted they didn't have much that they could do. They wrote letters begging for a systemic investigation into what happened, in which they could prove that they had fought as hard as they could against overwhelming odds. But the War Department refused that request, and Karl Schurz was quite upset about that. And so what happened is the German editors took the battle, and realizing that the soldiers could not get any justice within the army itself and within the overall Union war machine, they started taking to their own papers, and they started arguing what needed to be done. And a very interesting point here is that the assimilating German-American population of the North, because it was assimilating before the war, it was becoming more American, halted on that road of assimilation as a result of the nativism unleashed after Chancellorsville. As a result of this compilation of nativism, moreover, that's been going on since the beginning of the war, and Chancellorsville really brought it to a peak. And some of the German language papers that I researched for this work really brought this out, and they're fascinating. It tells you how hurt the Germans were by these attacks in the Anglo-American press. Here's an example. On the 16th of May, the Pittsburgher Democrat, this was a democratic German language paper, published a version of events about Chancellorsville that targeted General Howard and correctly put the blame on him, because by this point, reports had come in that Howard didn't reposition the Corps, despite the fact that Schurz and others had asked for this. And the editor claimed, quote, "For the idiocy of the commanding generals, the poor Corps must now take the fall. Hooker and especially General Howard are at fault. Both received several reports that the enemy had marched to our right flank and concentrated their great masses of troops, but nothing was done. We stayed where we were. Even our reserve artillery was not once brought into position. It remains just like the old song, what matters the lion courage of the soldier with generals that are not worth a shot of gunpowder. And yet they would have been worth that." That is just one of several examples I could give you. Karl Schurz and Friedrich Hecker, another 48er, he was colonel of the 82nd Illinois that fought at Chancellorsville, one of the Midwestern regiments that was sent to the east. They had a very lively correspondence after Chancellorsville, trying to figure out how do we respond to this resurge of nativism and the falsehoods that are being said about us. And Hecker wrote to Schurz on the 21st of May. He said, "If the Union fails, it will be considered the Dutch's fault. If we win, the Germans will be considered to have no share in this victory. If compromise is made, they will be the scapegoats of the North and the South alike. If this spirit prevails among this mongrel race of all tribes in the world, and if we are still alive, they will get double payback in the election of 1864. Here we see the harbingers of the German backlash. And Hecker was very powerful politically. This is an example of how the Germans are starting to think about what has happened to them. And it isn't just in the army. It isn't just in the eastern states and in the great cities of the East where a lot of these ethnic regiments came from. This was being reported in the Western German newspapers as well. And it's important that we think about that because it helps us understand why German America started to retreat from the assimilation that had begun before the Civil War. And they began to turn inward and to trust themselves more than Americans. Allow me to give you some more examples of how the German papers wrote about this. So the Philadelphia Fria Presse, this was a Republican paper out of Philadelphia, issued a warning to its readers and German Americans in general on the 29th of May. These anti-German attacks in the Anglo-American press had not stopped, and the morale of the German soldiers in the 11th Corps had bottomed out, which was very evident. They marched into the Gettysburg campaign with a chip on their shoulders, I might add. And the editor, Friedrich Thomas, asked, "What does it all mean? Is it stupidity or cunning calculated? Why now are only the Germans singled out? Are people angry in certain circles that the Germans and their leaders at Camp Jackson, Carthage, Pea Ridge, Bull Run, and Shiloh did not act cowardly, but took on the war with a good attitude and boldly beat the Southern brothers of our Northern cowards? Or do they wish that the Germans in our armies are forced home in order to weaken the courage of our arms? What is it then?" Now you're seeing cynicism and sarcasm coming out of these influential German papers, which so influenced the voting behavior of the North German American population. And another German paper, a very important one in Pennsylvania, wrote this, which I think is highly significant. The separateness of the German language press made the Germans appear unlike, quote, Americans. And this is how he put it. The Americans don't understand German. Moreover, they also don't know what the Germans want, and it really doesn't matter what is said, whether we remain quiet or whether we continue in a language they cannot read. The German newspapers are for the Americans so many empty sheets of paper. Asking what could be done to help the situation, the editor threw up his hands in rhetorical lamentation. German press will continue to print in German. Quote, hence the result is the same, because no one understands us. He mistrusts, despises, and encroaches upon us. And that will last as long as the Germans neglect to make themselves understandable to Americans through the press. And indeed, this represents this feeling of indignation and retreat from assimilation that you're going to see in 1863. It will persist throughout the Gettysburg campaign because the Germans are blamed once again for running on the first day. The attacks are a little more muted because Gettysburg ends up in a Union victory. But once again, the 11th Corps is singled out for blame. And the result was that the German Americans of the North will unify. And they'll start to have great rallies throughout the North in the late spring and the summer of 1863. And they begin to form a political opposition within the Republican Party itself. This is particularly strong in the Midwest. It is called the Fremont movement. And for a while, Abraham Lincoln has to contend with a sizable minority composed almost exclusively of German American voters in the Midwestern states. They failed to get the Eastern Germans on board, interestingly, because the two didn't agree very well. The Fremont movement for a while challenged Lincoln's nomination for the Republican Party. This was a direct outgrowth of the nativism unleashed upon the 11th Corps and overall German America as a result of Chancellorsville and to a lesser extent Gettysburg. And in 1864, Abraham Lincoln will lose the German vote by roughly the same percentage that he wins it in 1860. Does it cost him the election? Of course not, but nobody knew in the spring and the summer of 1863 that these other great Union victories, such as the fall of Atlanta and Chattanooga, were going to help with Lincoln's reelection. If those had not occurred, if Cedar Creek had not occurred or Mobile Bay, Lincoln would have needed those German votes that he lost as a result of the resurgence of nativism. And that's something for us to think about today, I think, when we're a country where everyone is essentially a minority and everyone is, every vote counts, as we say. What happens at a lower level can have a great effect at the highest levels of politics. And I like to emphasize this to my students when I take them to Chancellorsville and Gettysburg. Further, if Gettysburg had not turned into a Union victory, the New York City draft riots were probably going to happen anyway. And there was some German participation in these riots, which burned a percentage of the Big Apple in July of 1863, following the Battle of Gettysburg. It was primarily an Irish American riot, upset about the unfair draft laws, unhappy about emancipation and other issues. But this is emblematic of the ethnic disturbances and the ethnic unhappiness with the Northern cause at the midpoint of the war. And it indicates that it's not just the Germans, but the Irish too, for their own reasons, are very mistrustful of the Union war effort by this point. And indeed, for the Irish, because the Irish Brigade, another concentration of ethnic soldiery in the Army of the Potomac, had been all but destroyed in early war battles. They felt that their sacrifice, their blood sacrifice, was not being honored as well. And then you put the draft laws and you put emancipation on top of that, the sacking of McClellan, whom they believed was their darling. And the Irish are going to have their own reasons for turning even more against the Union than they had been before, at least the Republican Party, not the Union itself. And the Irish and the Germans will both begin to turn inward as the war progresses. They won't desert en masse. The regiments will persist, but they're going to start to get hollowed out because they can't get ethnic recruits to join particularly the German regiments as the war progresses. And so you have some of the great German regiments, like the 75th Pennsylvania I mentioned before, hollowed out and literally half Anglo-American by the end of the war with conscripts, because the German soldiers cannot be replaced. The nativism that surged earlier made a mark. One soldier whose letters I found hidden in a pension file in the National Archives really put it nicely. He wrote after the Battle of Chancellorsville to his brother back home in Pittsburgh, and he said, "I shan't re-enlist, and I recommend you don't enlist. I will not forget what they did to us after Chancellorsville, and you shouldn't either." And words to that effect, and continuing onward, which is representational of how a lot of the German soldiers felt about their treatment. And the end result of the American Civil War for the German soldiers of the North was not necessarily an assimilating experience. If you were in the German regiments in the Army of the Potomac, concentrated in the 11th Corps, you would not have a positive experience with your Anglo-American comrades. If you're in the Western German regiments, and you're scattered about in these various greater organizations that are of mixed ethnicity, you're going to march from victory to victory under better commanders, first of all, and secondly, there won't be as many bad reports in the Anglo-American press of your performance, but you'll be aware of what's happening in the East, and you're going to feel some kinship with your German brothers in the 11th Corps. And this did mute the assimilation process for the Western Germans, though not as much and not as pronounced as it would be for the Eastern Germans. So this melting pot paradigm of 19th century immigrant assimilation is a paradigm. It's not, as many scholars have gone on to build upon my work and others that first started to write about this. The Civil War was not a melting pot experience. It was actually a halting, a stalling of that process for a period of time for the North's major immigrant groups, particularly the Germans and the Irish. And you can see there, even in this post-war image from the Gilded Age, an angry Irishman refusing to be assimilated by the goddess of liberty. Most of the rest of them seem to be happy with it, but not the Irishman. And that's just emblematic, I think, of the greater syndrome. I would add, too, that not just was it a halting of assimilation, but it was a growing awareness of German, and with the Irish this occurred too, growing awareness of their own gifts that they could bring to the Union by retaining their ethnic traits. And so you see a blossoming of German America after the war, where kindergartens are going to not only proliferate in German American communities, but be exported to the rest of America, and they will accept them. And the Frankfurter will become a popular treat by the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. And other German Americanisms will start to be inculcated. German beer will become very popular with Anglo-Americans. And in many ways, the war, though it made German Americans stop their assimilation temporarily, it reinforced their German identity, and they rationalized this as an attempt to actually be more American. It was better to be more German in order to be more American, because we can bring our unique German ethnic gifts to the greater American melting pot and thus make America better. This was the rationalization, the justification that German Americans gave at that time after the Civil War was over. So with that, I'd like to end with one final slide, if I may. Let's see here if it will work. Well, maybe it's not. It's important to note that after the Civil War, the German soldiers who had served in it would not forget their ethnic identity, and they erected monuments around the great battlefields that often mentioned their ethnic identity. And there's one very famous monument in Pennsylvania at Gettysburg, erected by the 74th Pennsylvania, that marched out of Pittsburgh, and very boldly proclaimed on the monument is the term German regiment. They wanted people to know as late as the late 1880s that this had been a German organization, and it was proud of its German ethnicity despite the nativism that occurred during the war. And today that monument still stands as a monument, as a representation of that period of our ethnic history. And so with that, I'm going to finish my talk, and I'm going to release you to your own discussions. Thank you very much, Doug, for the opportunity, and thank you everyone for tuning in.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keller. A fascinating look at the German Americans, and never considered a lot of these issues before. If I could, this would be the part of, we're meeting in person, people would have the opportunity to ask a question of you. Do you mind if I ask you just one quick follow-up question about the program itself?
Please, absolutely.
When the 11th Corps went west in 1864 and participated in the Atlanta campaign, how was their reception from the other Westerners that were part of that army? How were they received?
So that's a great point, Doug, and a couple points to mention by way of background. So after Gettysburg, there were Anglo-American officers in the Army of the Potomac who came to Army Commander George Meade and forcefully requested that the 11th Corps be transferred out of the Army of the Potomac. Pay no attention to the fact that we won that battle and that the 11th Corps did pretty well on the 2nd of July. They had had enough, and the nativists within the Army of the Potomac did win out. We don't know the whole history there, whether they wrote to the War Department and Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, and so forth, but Meade did assent to the sending of the 11th and the 12th Corps to relieve the siege of Chattanooga. I don't think they were arbitrarily chosen, Doug. I think they were chosen to remove them from the Army of the Potomac. Both were seen as stepchildren to the core of the Army of the Potomac. The 12th Corps had fought in the Valley against Jackson and been defeated. The antecedent of the 11th Corps, the German division, had fought in the Valley and been defeated. It had been part of Pope's defeated Army of Virginia that failed at Second Manassas. They were never totally accepted for that. They were never totally accepted for the fact that they were predominantly an ethnic organization. So they are sent west. They do well in the relief of the siege of Chattanooga and then in the Battle of Chattanooga, particularly at Missionary Ridge and Tunnel Hill. And you start to see a redemption of the fighting reputation of the 11th Corps in the Western theater under, interestingly, still Joe Hooker, who gets transferred out there with them. And Howard hangs on as well. So they're still serving under these guys, but they do well out in the West. I think it's because of the greater leadership at higher levels under Ulysses S. Grant and others, and later Sherman. The 11th Corps remnants will participate in the march to Atlanta and then from Atlanta to the sea, where they still perform yeoman service and do well. There are not really any black marks on the German performance, as James Pula argues in his most recently published history of the 11th Corps. There aren't a lot of black marks at all once they get transferred to the West. And it's rather interesting. I mean, there was a little issue with Wauhatchie, which was a night action, but that was a small thing. The majority of the action that's undertaken by the 11th Corps are very positive. They're reported well in the press. And you have to wonder why that is. Is it because the Anglo-American press of the North realized it had made a big mistake earlier on? Were they given political pressure by the Lincoln administration? Were the Anglo-American generals of the Western theater more aware of this issue and fairer in their reporting? It's hard to say, and my own research doesn't really clarify exactly why their reputation is seen as well, less besmirched and certainly recovering in the latter half of the war. But I think it's a very stark contrast with the portrayal of the German soldiers in the first half of the war. The problem, Doug, is that the German Americans of the North saw this as too little too late. And it did not retard this halting of Americanization that I mentioned. It didn't stop it. it didn't stop this idea of retaining ethnic traits over Americanization. That process is going to continue through the second half of the war and into the post-war period. And I think, if anything, the successes of the 11th Corps in the Western campaigns, once they're transferred there, reinforced that they actually were good soldiers. They were good fighters, made them proud of their service, and in some ways made those soldiers who still remained in the German regiments staunchly defensive and staunchly proud of their German ethnic identity. So I think it just reinforced it because they ended on a good note, so to speak.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the Zoom profile with us today, taking the time to do this program for our museum, adding a ton of information to our existing exhibit, and adding so much to the story of what makes the Midwest unique within this conflict. So we hope to get you out. Christian, if you're ever in the Midwest, you have a standing invitation to come to Kenosha and to do a program with us here live and in person. We'd love to have you.
Thank you very much, Doug. It'd be a real pleasure.
Okay, take care. We'll talk to you again soon, I'm sure.
Bye-bye.